to get everyone quiet there, but that's how it works. I'm really excited about the program tonight. How many people watched some of the Ken Burns series about the American Revolution? Right? I think you probably know, if you came to a program like this, that there were no battles in the American Revolution in Dutchess County. Definitely like some conflict between loyalists and patriots. Wasn't exactly peaceful here during the war. But probably the most important thing that happened during the American Revolution in Dutchess County is the subject of our talk tonight. And so we're really fortunate to have two special guests. Our main speaker tonight, right, is Tim Abbott, right? He's the one in civilian clothes up there. Tim lives in Connecticut. He came over from Connecticut. He is the executive director of the Housatonic Valley Association, but he used to live in Millbrook because his father was the headmaster at the Millbrook School back in the 70s and 80s. And so, like he said, this feels like a homecoming for him, so we're happy to have him back. And then we have Joe Forte, who is from, I don't know, should I say? He lives in Kingston, but I want to introduce him as like from across the pond or something like that.
Well, if you mean Oswego Road Pond, yes, because that's where I originally went to school.
And he's brought a display of stuff up here, and so he can talk a little bit at the end of the program too about that and be a chance to look at it. So we're going to have a talk here from Tim. If you'll save questions at the end, they can both answer questions once we get to the conclusion. All right? Should we get started?
Yes.
All right.
Wonderful.
Turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you. And I'm aware that you are also recording this, so I'll try not to range too far away from the friends on the screen. Wow, I wasn't expecting as many people on a winter night, and I'm just delighted to see you. I hope this meets your expectations. As was kindly mentioned, I am kind of a local boy. I had 14 years at Millbrook School as the headmaster's kid. What fun! From 1976 to 1990. So that gets me from second grade to college. Moved back to the area, but on the Connecticut side of the line, and have pursued a career in conservation. The reason I said that is not just so that you'll like me, but because I'm used to having to navigate sort of permeable boundaries and jurisdictions in my life. Like growing up at Millbrook School, the school district's in Menia, you vote in Stamford, and post office was here. And we went to Sharon Hospital. So I'm used to that. That's a piece of the story I'm about to tell you too, because it is about a logistically challenging problem that Continental Congress, George Washington faced in the fall of 1778, involving a fellow who looks like my friend here, and about 5,000 more of them, some German-speaking, who were enemy combatants who didn't really have a long-term solution of what to do with them. And that's a year after this, which is the surrender of General Burgoyne's remaining troops after the Saratoga campaign, which most of us learned was the turning point of the war, and I think that is a fair statement, and which didn't happen by accident. And I'm not here tonight to talk to you about whether Howe let him down or not. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it was not coordinating with other forces that were in the mid-Atlantic, taking over Pennsylvania, taking over Philadelphia. It was ultimately a push up, not down, Lake Champlain from Canada, some fighting at Bennington after taking over Fort Ticonderoga, 2 battles, Stillwater and Bemis Heights in the Saratoga area, and finally a surrender under something called the Saratoga Articles of Convention. So these are called the Convention Army or the Convention Troops because of the way that they capitulated. And I mean no slight to them. They fought incredibly hard. They endured an enormous amount, unsupported. It isn't about bravery. It isn't about their personal failure. It's about being overwhelmed and unsupported at the end of a campaign with winter coming on. And what was fascinating about these surrender terms in mid-October of 1777 is that they were incredibly generous. Burgoyne's remaining army at that time included Canadians, Loyalists, some native auxiliaries, largely from Upper Canada, and about equal parts of British troops and hired German troops. There's no Germany, there are many German-speaking states. Most of those Germans come from Brunswick, so they're called Brunswickers. Some of them come from Hesse-Hanau. So to call them Hessians, you're really only talking about one group of artillerymen and one small group of Jaegers or huntsmen. The rest of them are Brunswickers. Doesn't matter. But people at that time pretty much lumped them all together as Hessians, and that's how we remember them. And what to do with these men? The convention said the Canadians can go home. The native auxiliaries, any that were left, had probably already left. There were, I'm sorry, I can speak a little closer if you'd like. There are almost 200 women and children with this army. And they're going to take a lot of care and feeding if they kept them for a long time. So the idea was, we'll send them back to Europe. We'll take them to Boston, march the British on the northern route through the Berkshires, march the Germans on the southern route through the Berkshires, and put them on some ships and send them back to Europe, promising not to fight against us again, which Congress hated. This was a terrible, terrible thing from Congress's perspective, because if you send 5,000 to 6,000 enemy combatants to Europe, then that frees up other troops to come here. You want these guys off the board. And it also presented a problem for the king, who did not want to recognize Congress and wasn't going to sign anything that they had ratified. So they became enemy combatants in limbo. And for a while they were in Winter Hill outside of Boston. And then they decided it would probably be better to keep the Germans there and move the British a little more inland, so they encamped in Rutland, Mass. And to give you a sense of what's going on in the rest of the colonies at that point, Newport, Rhode Island is in British hands. So that's the nearest place for supplying these troops, which the Americans insisted the British had to do. Pay for their room and board, send them new uniforms. We're not doing that. Philadelphia is occupied by Sir William Howe and his army, having had a successful Philadelphia campaign, Battle of Brandywine, Battle of Germantown. Washington and his main army are having a very bad winter at Valley Forge. And here's all these enemy prisoners from the triumph of Saratoga, but they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to keep them or what to do with them. And all of the other soldiers that were captured before that, who had been part of Burgoyne's army, were not covered by that. They were other kinds of prisoners. They were in Connecticut, they were working on farms, they were farmed out to do other things. They're not covered under this. But this was different because of the way in which they were surrendered. And then in March 1778, everything changes and it becomes a global war. Because Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane in France negotiate an alliance, and France enters the war on the side of the colonists. Which means that Philadelphia doesn't matter anymore. It means Howe is going to say, I think I'm done, time to go home. So he does. And it means General Sir Henry Clinton, his second in command, becomes the overall commander of British troops. He's in New York. He's got to go to Philadelphia, extricate all of those soldiers, bring them back to New York, and then send something like 10,000 men to other parts of the British Empire, because now the Caribbean is threatened. Now Gibraltar is threatened. Now there's fighting in India. And then there's these guys, which is a source of manpower kind of close to the sea. And as 1778 plays on, there's the Battle of Monmouth as part of that retreat of the main British forces from Philadelphia back to New York. And then Washington is left trying to figure out where to position his troops in case they're going to make a run up the Hudson again or do other things. And what they actually end up doing is a huge forage to support an exodus of a large number of British troops and Loyalist troops to places like East and West Florida and the Caribbean and far, far away. And it starts to worry Congress, this available pool of manpower, eating provisions that Massachusetts cannot afford because they have to be sending it to support the Continental troops, a little uncomfortably too close to Newport, still held by the British, still a deep water port with ships bringing things in. And the thought is, we got to put those guys somewhere where they're not eating all our stuff and they can't be recaptured and used against us to reinforce the New York garrison, which is having some of these men away. Where should we put them? And the thought was, Virginia's a nice, quiet place. They haven't had much war since 1776. They got supplies. Let's send them there. And they thought this in October of 1778, a year after the capture. How would you do it? You can't march that close to New York. It's occupied. So that rules out Kings Ferry and Dobbs Ferry and the areas in the Hudson Highlands that include Stony Point, Fort Planks Point, Fort Montgomery, all of which, by the way, were overrun by Sir Henry Clinton at the end of the Burgoyne campaign when he came up and burned Kingston. So it's got to be Fishkill. They're going to have to cross the Hudson at Fishkill and go to Newburgh from there and march inland, ultimately to Charlottesville, Virginia. Arguably the longest march of the war. I guess maybe George Rogers Clark, who went to Illinois, might have a different mileage number than that, but this is what it says on the plaque in my town, so I'm sticking with it. The longest, probably, march undertaken during the war, and undertaken, by the way, in late fall and early winter of 1778, by about 4,300 of the remaining troops of convention, roughly split between British and German-speaking, and their dependents, women and children. And now we get to logistics. How do you do that? How do you get Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia to coordinate, to accommodate the movement of this many prisoners who need to be housed, who need to be fed, who need transportation for their baggage, who need to be guarded so they don't all run down to New York? And this gets us to how Washington felt about the militia. So let's take a step back for a second. Most of you in school, and I already told you I was here in 1976. Stay there, 1976. So I have my Town of Stanford wooden nickel from the bicentennial that I got. But we were basically taught at the beginning of the war, it was local militia, yeoman farmers, fighting behind fences, going back to the plow after, Henry Knox did that thing with a cannon, and some other things happened, and there was this, and there was Yorktown. There's so much more in between that. And one of the questions, we have to go to a fellow named Thomas Paine, the one who was talking about sunshine soldiers and summer patriots, and these are the times that try men's souls, and he was talking about that. But one of the darkest periods in the Continental Army's history, when the Army was melting away, in part because of short-term enlistments. And the militia in New Jersey at that time had their families to worry about. They weren't going to stay with Washington. Washington was quite upset about the fickleness of militia. He felt he could not count on them. Even Thomas Paine said, they're just the thing for a short campaign, but they will not do for a long engagement. There's also the problem about having long-term standing armies, right? These are Republican small r. It should be your zeal for country and your patriotism that makes you enlist to turn back an oppressive foe, not being paid for long-term service. Plus, standing armies can be a threat to government. But they needed a standing army, and in 1777 they got one, where people enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war. Where's that army right now? In the period that we're talking about, October of 1778, Washington's main army, most of it, is down in what's now Paterson, in a place called Fredericksburg. not too far from Fishkill in the depot there, kind of waiting to see what's going to happen in New York. And what's happening in New York is a grand forage that's raiding into Westchester County and Burgoyne County and places like that. That's where Washington is. He's got a few of the brigades from his main army that are a little closer to here. He's got one in Connecticut. It's Poor's Brigade. They're New Hampshire men. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd New Hampshire, and a very strange regiment called the 2nd Canadian. Congress's own. 2 battalions strong, raised not exclusively in Canada, but originating during that first Canada campaign in 1776. And they're there, and Washington says, you know, I don't think that the Massachusetts militia is going to hand off these marching men in any kind of orderly fashion to the Connecticut militia. And I have no confidence that the Connecticut militia are going to turn them over to the New York militia where they're supposed to. I got to send somebody to oversee this, and I got to send orders to at least get Poor's Brigade to escort them. But it was already underway, so they had minimal impact on it. But the guy he sent to organize the whole thing was a Virginia cavalryman dressed quite a lot like this guy, who happens to be a Connecticut cavalryman named Moses Seymour, but named Theodoric Bland. He's the colonel of the 1st Virginia. Washington knows him, and Washington says, Bland, I need you to go up and make this thing work. You can take your major with you. Go sort the militia out, figure out how to house and move along the interior lines so they don't get captured by others. This force of enemy prisoners on their way to Charlottesville. And Bland sort of gulped and said okay, and rode, and found it already well underway. The idea was to move them in 6 divisions, or 6 groups, picking up the British troops from Rutland, Mass., and then sending the first 3 divisions, about 600 men at a time, under escort, to Enfield, Connecticut, where they would be met by the Connecticut militia. And so there would be along the road 600 men camping in this spot, and then 600 men replacing them 6 times. So you're going to get almost a week of impact at each site where they camped, which, if you are a metal detectorist, makes this kind of interesting. Because some of those campsites, particularly in Connecticut, I did a lot of research on, and they remain undisturbed. So that'll be fun someday, not as a looter, to go and document and check out. That also required the citizens in the area providing baggage, providing their barns for these men to sleep in. So it's not just guarding them, it's feeding them. And the officers are not going to sleep in barns. They have ideas about what they're entitled to. They're going to sleep in your house. So it kind of depends on what your feeling is about this, whether you're up for that or not, and whether you're going to listen to the militia when they say, look, I'm terribly sorry, but I need to use your barn and your bed. Put this German in it. And the reason I'm saying that is because the Germans in particular kept really interesting journals. Because at this point, they're out of the war, they're tourists. Most of the British did not. They're resentful. They would like very much to slip away and get down to New York and reincorporate in the British Army, and a number of them do. But the German journals are fascinating. A lot of them have not been readily available and translated, so I got someone to do that for me for the Connecticut part. And oh my goodness, it's gossip. I'll describe the Connecticut part for you before I tell you about here, because that's where I spent most of my thinking on this. They came into Enfield, Connecticut, which is on the east side of the Connecticut River, and they had to cross that river in large flatboats. 3 men in 1 division drowned when they fell off that flatboat. And there's at least one German who seemed to meet a girl every night at every place they were, and sort of described, you know, pretty girl in tavern, pretty black girl in tavern, danced in Suffield with pretty girls. I think there were amorous connections for that particular gentleman, but there were several times when you got to imagine if you are a inhabitant of Western New England or Eastern New York at that time, this is the most exotic thing that has happened in your lifetime. People didn't write, Henry Knox came through the Berkshires today. They just didn't write about it. But lots of people wrote about, look at these crazy Germans and listen to their songs and listen to the stuff. Mostly they're talking about the Germans. They've seen this guy before. But they're absolutely fascinated by these foreigners in their midst. And the foreigners are fascinated too. They're like, we wondered when we would get to the town. In this case, I'm talking about a part of Connecticut called Simsbury. And it's 6 miles long. And we asked on the first mile, like, yeah, you're in Simsbury. And we asked on the fourth mile, you're still in Simsbury. But we saw no town, because the scale of our townships and our precincts was not what they were used to. And there was no settlement worthy of its name in most of those places, including here, by the way. I'm assuming some of you know a little of what Millbrook was before it was Millbrook, but we're getting to that part of the story. Very lightly populated, and initially by Quakers, who have a problem with this war. And that problem is pacifism. And some of them, because of that, and other reasons, have a tendency toward loyalism. And some of them are trying to be neutral, and there's no room for neutrality in the patriot mind. And that's the part of the story I'll get to when we're here. But again, lightly populated. And roads that are a poem. There's a section of what's called the Greenwoods Road where I live. And there were several tracks of it that went through the southern Berkshires and northern Connecticut. Called the Greenwoods because stands and stands and stands of hemlock and white pine were there at that time. Henry Knox and his guys went through 10 miles north of the section I'm talking about in Massachusetts. But the section that these guys went along went from what's now Winsted, Connecticut, Winchester, up into Colebrook and Norfolk and on from there into Canaan. And it was a miserably cold, muddy road. Imagine marching in late fall, and you haven't had a nice new uniform dispersed to you, and by the time Poor's brigade gets there, 4 of the divisions have already moved forward with the Connecticut militia doing what they're supposed to do. So the 5th Division is escorted by Poor, and Poor's got cannons with him, which are hard to drag up mountains and make roads into quagmires. If they were completely frozen roads, this would have worked, but they weren't. So the 5th and the 6th Divisions, and the last 3 divisions are German, get stuck in the woods. They don't make it to Norfolk that night. They're sleeping somewhere along modern Route 44 now, kind of near, far enough away so this won't mean anything to you, but there's a filling station, and the hill next to that is where they were. And so the whole regular process of let's just move 600 men at a time to the site that we prepared beforehand breaks down there. So some of them marched from Norfolk, Connecticut to Sharon, Connecticut. 4 of the 6 divisions did. Through what was then 1 Canaan, now is North Canaan and Canaan. And then they stopped, because there was no one to meet them on the other side. And 2 of them marched to Salisbury and to Sharon from there. And there's, again, really interesting journals about balls that were held, barns that were filled with men. In one case in Barkhamsted, Connecticut, the journal says there were 4 houses and 8 barns in the whole town. We were bedded, these are officers, German officers, we were bedded in the beds of some farmers, and then late at night the farmers came in, took off their clothes, and got in bed with us, which we thought was very odd. Farmers were having none of it. It's like, that's where I'm sleeping, deal with it. But everything fell apart in Sharon, because indeed, the Connecticut militia were more than happy to do their job in Connecticut and had no interest whatsoever to go to what is now Median. And there wasn't much of a militia here to meet them. That piece wasn't working. It would have required better coordination, state to state to state, for that to have happened. So they start piling up. First you got 600, now you've got 1,200. And by the way, in Connecticut, there are 82 desertions, about equally divided between British troops who disappear into the woods and German troops who stick around or disappear into the woods. So they're hemorrhaging small numbers as they go. This is a problem. So Theodoric Bland writes to Washington down in Fredericksburg and says, I'm going to need a little help. And Washington turns to General Mad Anthony Wayne, who commands 2 brigades of Pennsylvanians. And he says, Wayne, I need you to send 500 men, a detachment of 500 men, up to Sharon to bring the convention troops through New York to Fishkill, and maybe if you've got the time, get them over to Sussex County, New Jersey. Wayne writes to Bland. It's a great letter. It's full of like arrogance and confidence, and it says something like, Dear Bland, I see that the Connecticut militia are but a militia. I send you soldiers. You can expect them tomorrow. And I actually went to Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and photographed quarterly books from one of those regiments that contained all the orders given by Wayne at that time. And in the 3rd Pennsylvania, it records his order that as soon as you have drawn your new uniforms, new fancy French contracted blue uniforms with red facings that they had ready to disperse, as soon as you've drawn those, take 500 men, take this officer, take that officer, and get yourself up to Sharon to help Bland out. And then Wayne said to the 3rd Pennsylvania, I need 1 captain, 1 lieutenant, I need 4 sergeants, I need 2 drummers, and I need 50 enlisted men. They didn't just take 1 solid company for things like this. They drew them from throughout the regiment. Because regiments have to be able to act together on a battlefield at battalion strength, and if you remove a company, it throws everything off. So instead, they depleted them and made them all weaker and sent these guys off to do this. They didn't all get to Sharon in time to move together. So the 1st division that kicks off from Sharon does so on the 24th of November and comes here. And that's the part I've been thinking about today. Where did they go? They went to Mabbitt's, not Mabbittsville. They went to Samuel Mabbitt's store. Samuel Mabbitt's, Quaker. Son is either Joseph or Jonathan, can't remember. And the journals talk about the landlord is a notorious Tory, because he was indeed a loyalist. And where was it? South Millbrook, in the part of Millbrook that was called Mechanic. They marched that in a day. They marched from the center of Sharon, Connecticut to there in a day. The first troops got there, and it's interesting, there's 2 letters that Bland wrote at that time. One of them is dated the 24th, and then the subscript is Dover Precinct Mabbitt's, which is fascinating that he's thinking of himself more in that area, but it's not in Dover, it's here. And now I will confess my ignorance. What's the route that got him here? Let's think about it. If you're in Sharon, Connecticut, and you take Route 343 to Amenia, you're on the old Poughkeepsie Dutchess Turnpike, which is 1806. So that wasn't there. Something was there, but that wasn't there. You could have gone Leedsville, Wassaic direction. You could have gone Amenia Union, which is what I think they did. But then how did they get up over the ridge? Along what's 343 essentially to here. Because that is what they did. Down that way a little bit. Me driving here tonight, which I did from Cornwall Bridge, so I just said, fine, let's say I'm taking Route 44. 13 miles to where I'm standing from Sharon on a route that didn't exist. And the average day for these guys to hike is about 12 miles, so they pushed it that day. And it was just the first group, and they're still waiting for more guards. And they're trying to get to Fishkill. And Bland writes his other letter that says, we are worried that we're going through some loyalist areas, and that the men, particularly the men in the early divisions, the British troops, are going to be induced to desert. So I've had to take more of the Continental soldiers to guard the first 3 divisions than the Germans. But the Germans have been pretty docile, and we're not too worried about them. And that's an interesting thought too. And still there's desertions. There's an artillery sergeant named Sergeant Lamb, who I know you know of, who escaped at that time and made his way down to New York and wrote about it and later became a British general. There were plenty who were able to get away along the way. About 10% losses from desertion in the convention troops on their way to Virginia. From here, there's a place I have no idea where it is. It's just called Shays. Somebody, not Daniel, he's from Massachusetts, but somebody with that name between here and Fishkill is a stopover point too. Where are we going to put that beacon? I don't know. Have to look. And then when they got to Fishkill, the first troops get there on the 27th or 8th of November. And Washington's there to see it. He comes over from the Fredericksburg encampment. I think he's at Brinkerhoff's house. And he observes the convention troops with his own eyes. And what is he thinking? Because the guy whose victory this is one of Washington's nemesis, Horatio Gates. A guy who some folks in Congress and some Continental generals wanted to replace as Commander-in-Chief Washington with the year before. On the other hand, he has dealt with that problem. Gates has been properly chastised. The so-called Conway cabal that undermined Washington has been dispersed. But still, he's looking at someone else's victory. But he's looking at it from a position of strength. And he's feeling some satisfaction, I imagine, about that. And all these Continental troops, not militia, doing the job that he thought they could do. It's still, when the 1st Division is in Fishkill, the last division is in Canaan, Connecticut. They haven't even gotten to Sharon yet. So they're still spread out 5 or 6 days apart. The Fishkill event appears in several journals, and then they basically are taking flatboats and ferry boats and God knows what over to Newburgh. And from there through Orange County, places like Goshen and Wallkill, and they end up in sort of Sussex County, New Jersey, Easton, Pennsylvania. In mid-December, they're in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. You stay there for a while. There's a place called Camp Security where some really interesting archaeology has been done from longer-term stay of the convention troops there a little later on. And in January, they are in Charlottesville, Virginia. Escorted, I can't tell you by whom. It wasn't Anthony Wayne. Whether the militia did their job or not, we know they did in Connecticut, we know they did in Massachusetts, we know there was not good coordination here in New York. What did that ultimately accomplish? It eased pressure on New England, which was having to provide for these men food and sustenance, even if it was being paid for by the British. And it did remove them as a source of potential manpower to reinforce the British Army in New York, since that garrison had been depleted. It did do that. But it also made them a burden for the rest of the war on other places. And they didn't keep them there in 1781 when the war had suddenly come to Virginia. They moved them back to Pennsylvania and ultimately Windsor, Connecticut. And what was left, what hadn't been officers who had been paroled or men who had deserted, ultimately did not get back to Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau and England until 1783. It's a long time to be enemy combatants. And it's a long time for some of them to look around and say, you know, my life here is better than it is in Germany, maybe I'll stay, although their family would suffer if they didn't go back. And the challenge that each of these states had in transporting the men is played out after the war, and how are we going to function together as a country. And so the anti-federal model says each state kind of coordinates itself, and, you know, except in times of defense, you know, stick to your own stuff. And sometimes that works. But it doesn't work for strategic, logistical, coordinated work, which is why, you know, the National Guard, when it is called up, is ultimately federalized when it has to go to something like that. Washington only had Theodoric Bland and his major. That was the federalizing force. And he also had the willingness, maybe less enthusiastically, of the communities through which they passed to accommodate these folks. And in some places, like Salisbury, Connecticut, the well-to-do were more than happy to host the officers and throw a party. And the men slept in fields or in barns. If you're interested in pursuing this stuff and you want to read some things, one of the Brunswick journals, the so-called DeRoy Journal, was translated by a woman named Helga Doblin, and is, although out of print, this library probably has it and others can, and it's an interesting read, and it is the account from one of the officers in the Regiment von Specht of his experiences in America, and it describes, sometimes in very brief detail, places you know, and it describes what his experience was like. Sometimes the journals are really frustrating because all they say is march 12 miles, got to Mabbotts. Okay. So we have to use other information to figure out those routes. Occasionally they're full of really interesting anecdotes. But it's not as well studied as you'd want. Like, no one's written the definitive story of the convention troops. They've written pieces of it. There's a lot of there's a good book about, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's like, it's about the enemy soldiers in Pennsylvania that came out a couple years ago. It describes some of it. But this is me making a plug for why local enthusiastic historical research is a good idea. As long as you're comfortable saying mythology is a problem, and occasionally we can't prove things, which is good. Like, it's good to be able to say that. And sometimes that means getting rid of long-cherished anecdotes. George Washington might or might not have slept here, things like that, right? But I don't mean to make light of it. The 19th century town historians were trying to build a sense of who we were as a country and a connection to an almost vanished past. And they got some of it wrong. But so did the soldiers in their old age when they were applying for pensions. It doesn't mean they weren't there. It means the years had sort of made it a little harder to put the pieces together. But there are some pieces there for us to find. So if y'all get really interested in what do they mean by stated shays, what the hell is that? Or what colonial road evidence do we have in the Dutchess Historical Society or in the vaults of distant 19th century memory? Those journals are going to be really helpful for you to piece those pieces together. And when I do that, for me it connects me to a place I think I know pretty well in a totally different way. And it connects me to a time that is hard to approach, even though I also like to dress up like this, although I do it on the Continental side, and immerse myself in an 18th century world as an older, heavier guy than they were, right? But even with that caveat, once you've got that feeling that, you know, this land was not always the way it is now, and these events happened, and you have the context, which is a global war, you start looking at things a little differently. And you start seeing layer upon layer of story and place and connection to it. That's why I like doing this stuff. I intended to show you a lot of words, but it turns out I spoke them, so you didn't have to see that. I'm going to pause for a moment. I know you've got some questions. But I also want to let my friend talk a little bit from the perspective of one of those soldiers, one of those regiments, and explain a little bit about what he is portraying, and then I'll take some questions, and then I know he wants to talk as well. So.
Thank you. So I am a member of the 24th Regiment of Foot, one of the more illustrious regiments, while not a royal regiment. We missed that by 2 weeks. Most people are aware of the 24th because of the Michael Caine film Zulu, where we were slaughtered at Isla Dubana in South Africa, in 1879. 1879. We might not have always had the best luck. So, flashback to us here. We came over into Canada as part of Burgoyne's troops, and already we were met with the logistical issues that had been mentioned. Our new uniforms, for example, were actually, the ships were either iced in or blown off course. And so what we did get, while our uniforms were turning to rags, were new tents. Great, can't wear a tent. So the officers actually gave us the order to take our longer coats, coats, cut them into jackets, use the excess material for things like hats or patching material, take our old tents, turn them into gaitered trousers instead of what would be your common knee breeches, and wear the old tents as clothes. So already we're running into logistical issues even before we've crossed the border and begun the march south. General Burgoyne, having been a veteran of war here in the Americas, especially in the New York frontier, was well aware of the challenges that suited here, that they were faced here, rather than the wide open European battlefields. It's where you'll notice my cap, which is known as a Burgoyne cap, is a little different than what you would normally think when you picture us redcoats or you've watched that Mel Gibson movie that will not be named.
Right. Five.
Yeah. You know, the respawning ramrods as we throw them away. This would be called your cocked hat. These are very nice if you're not going through the woods of basically the frontier of New England, and New York especially. Get knocked around. So he actually gave orders, and there is some conjecture that it was actually the Grenadier Company of my regiment, the 24th, that came up with this initial design, and he was so enamored by it that he had it the order extended to the rest of the Army. They were cut down, it's the same hat, just with pieces removed, and then just because we have to have a decorative flair, and the colors actually do mean something, which I can get to, we were ordered to take horsehair and decorate the crest of the cap. A fun little anecdote for Burgoyne's campaign, or army up in Canada, is it was said that there was not a horse or cow within 20 miles of any British camp that still had hair on it. Because they were told to do this. They weren't actually given the supplies. A lot of this, again, was either local resources, everything was bought and paid for. There wasn't, the British Army was trying to, they were the civilized, professional force. And the women of the regiments, those dependents, followed behind. And they were doing the laundry, they were doing cooking, baking, sewing. When we were given the order to make the trousers, it was actually the wives and women of the regiment that were paid because the tailors were completely overwhelmed. So, of course now I went off on that and now I'm lost. So we begin down, go through Lake Champlain, Ticonderoga, Bennington, Hubbardton. We end up, of course, at Saratoga, which our redoubt never fell.
There you go. Well done.
All right, the 24th, we never, it was actually unfortunately the Germans that were overrun. So then we get into this, as was said, what do you do with this? When we started up in Canada, there were roughly between 500 and 600 of the British regiment, 24th Regiment of Foot. At the end of '83, when we are paroled and released to go back, there were 60 left. So, obviously, a lot of that is going to be tied into combat casualties, disease along the march, either wandering away to local farms and local ladies and kind of beginning a quiet life, trying to burn the uniform and blend in, or making the run for New York, which there are several documented cases of 24th men slipping away and making it to New York to rejoin the fight. Again, not a lot of information was actually written. One of our commanders, General Simon Fraser, who was my regimental commander, ends up actually dying he ends up being killed up at Saratoga, and all his baggage is taken back to Scotland, where he's from, and put into the estate there. They never open it. So all of his journals, all of his letters, all of his uniforms, everything is still sitting there. And we have reached out personally to the Fraser clan still, and they won't allow it to be open to look at. So there's a lot of these things that are buried away, little journals here and there, And that information is just unfortunately just out of reach. We know it's there, we can't actually get to it. And then, yeah, so then we end up doing the longest march, which I do actually like that term, that's a good one. I think I'm gonna put that on a shirt.
I think you should.
You know, and then, as I said, about 60 of us end up being paroled back.
By longest march, we're talking 740, 750 miles. And not always by a direct route. So I think the very longest one might be as much as 770 for people who took some of the slightly different paths to get to Sharon, Connecticut, things like that.
What you see here is basically what I would have been wearing as I came through here. Obviously, any of what would be, the terms of the convention were that the king's property was to be handed in. Now, there's a very interesting way that the British forces were equipped and supplied. Some of it was the king's property, such as my musket, what would have been my cartridge box, which is specifically referred to in the convention, and other articles. What was not included was anything else, which would have been the colonel's property, because the colonel of each regiment also paid for equipment for that regiment. And one kind of like little vexing rub was the difference between, and it's literally verbiage, between a cartridge box and a cartridge pouch. Now, a cartridge box would have been considered normally something that held about 18 rounds and was worn on a waist belt. And this is basically the difference is the Americans, the colonials, Continentals if you were, used the term interchangeably. Cartridge box, cartridge pouch, it all meant the same thing. It was very different meanings in the British Army. And so, as part of the arrangement, we were allowed to keep our cartridge pouches, not our cartridge boxes, which are usually bigger and very nice for holding additional forage, supplies, anything like that when you're not allowed to carry your powder and ball anymore.
Can you say something about what happens when you lose uniform buttons?
They create very interesting paradoxes later on when they are found. Anything in particular?
The idea that you might have multiple regimental buttons on your uniform?
Yes, yes. So one thing is, right, so obviously when I get this, everything is all marked 24th, and these are actually cast off originals that were dug, so these are what they looked like. However, as you go through, it's not that there's a constant supply. So you would use whatever was available. Sometimes it might be a little balled up piece of wool or cloth covered in that facing material, that colored material, that would be a soft cover button or a self-cover button. Other times you would grab whatever you had on hand. As you're marching, if we happen to be behind the 9th Regiment of Foot and someone drops a button, I'm going to pick it up because I might need that later. I'm not going to try to go give it back to him, I'm going to use it for me. So then you end up with either mixed bags of equipment or very interesting things where you begin to find regiments archaeologically where they never were.
Yes.
Because it was someone else actually marching with those on their uniform.
From the archaeology of this is maybe where I will wrap us up and then we'll take questions. You find a lot of buttons at encampments associated with even a day or two of an army's presence. You sometimes also find what are called sleeve links or sleeve buttons, which are cuff links. Because if you're going to wash a shirt with a stick, you know, you're not going to have a bone button there. You're going to have something soft or something removable. And those get lost all the time. Each of us has probably contributed ours to the archaeological record at places where we've dressed up and done this. You sometimes find really interesting identifying pieces like that 24th Regiment badge there on the pouch, did you say?
Yes.
On the pouch. American, I don't know the difference. And with the Germans, there's no numbers on them at all. They're just plain, slightly domed Tombeck buttons, which you could also see. There are 2 colors, but beyond that, if you just found that, it could easily have been similar to what a normal civilian could have worn in that same period, so you need more. However, if I found a whole bunch of them in a place where I think these guys actually camped, I'd be curious. And it doesn't take much to add to the archaeological record. It also doesn't take much to destroy it. And so my little comment about looting there is my other caution. As cool as it is to find stuff like that, if you are not part of a archaeologically valid survey, you're just robbing history. Not just the item, which as soon as you take it out has no context, right? But now we can't interpret it. Great, it's a button, thank you. What he's talking about is where the combination of archaeology, artifact, and history come together. And you need both to make sense of something like this. And yeah, there's about 3 sites in Connecticut I would love to do that kind of work on, which is why I wrote a paper for the state archaeologist in 2011, which was my introduction to him. Hi, I'm Tim, here's a term paper. And I took him to some of the sites because I simply wanted there to be a method of assessing whether a place was worthy of that kind of follow-up. But somebody with a metal detector in an afternoon could destroy that. So, that's the cautionary tale.
I can add one little bit onto
Yes.
that. One thing that's really interesting, so, I'm actually, this is my spoon. There were a whole bunch that were discovered at Fort Montgomery, which of course was taken by General Vaughan's forces as he came up the Hudson in October of '77, on the way to the state capital of Kingston. Now, what they did, and that's actually what they cut them down from full-size spoons and put them in their watch pocket, because not every soldier had a watch. You were given the watch when you were on watch. So you've got this awesome pocket, and what do you do with it? Because when you don't necessarily always have your haversack or anything else around, you need somewhere to put this, because this is important, because this is how you eat, drink, whatever. So they cut them down and put them in their watch pocket. Now, one very important thing why that taking things out of context is dangerous. These were found underneath the burn layer at Fort Montgomery. So we know that the soldiers that were stationed there before the British raised it were using them. So there actually is evidence that this was something that wasn't just after the war or someone else decided to cut these things down. As soon as you take something out of that earth though, right, you remove that context. Now you don't know, was this bent, did it break? You remove all that information that you can learn, not just from the object itself, the artifact, but the ground and the context of where it came from.
You've been very patient listening to both of us talk. We'll be happy to take some questions. Yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity, what were they eating?
Huh.
What were they having for breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
So now you get into, we have both beforehand and afterhand, right?
I'll do the after, you do the...
Okay, so before you have your standard, which was your pound of meat, usually either salt pork or beef. Everything was heavily salted. Peas, and a lot of it was either what you could also supplement from buying from your sutlers, which were basically vendors that followed the army along with the followers and the dependents, or from local towns. So that was basically, so a pound of that, either rice or flour, and how they transported flour at the time, especially the British Army, was what we later on in the Civil War become known as hardtack. At the time, it's ship's biscuits, which is basically flour and water. Because I love this part.
Yeah, if you've got hardtack, call it out.
The British, or the Germans, were actually very upset because they were used to actually getting legit loaves of bread.
Real bread, yes.
Real bread.
Soft bread.
Not this. Flour.
Not air hockey pucks.
Yes, literally flour, water, a little bit of salt, and cooked for upwards of 8 hours at less than 200 degrees. Every ounce of moisture is gone.
Holy cow.
Theoretically, the surviving examples from the Civil War would technically be edible if you wanted to risk your teeth. I am not one of those. What they would often do is grind them up. It was basically a way of transporting the flour. You would actually grind them back up with your muskets, with the butt of the musket, or rocks, or what have you, turning them somewhat back into a powdery, floury kind of form, and then use them for whether it's ash cakes, to thicken soups or stews, whatnot.
Oh, wow.
The idea of just dunking it in coffee, it's not going to work.
That's fairly similar to what the Continental Army should have gotten, but we now run into massive economic challenges. We have the problem of much of the available manpower is in the Army. If Washington needs men who are enlisting for 3 years of the war, those are the poorest, the youngest, the most expendable men. They're your farm laborers. That's where they are. New England doesn't produce wheat at this period of time. The places that do are the Mohawk and Schoharie Valley, which is the frontier, which is being raided all the time. The Delaware Water Gap up to Port Jervis, the so-called Minnesink Valley, or the southern part of it, equally being raided all of the time. And Pennsylvania, which is essentially Ukraine. It is the breadbasket of Europe. And its wheat is what kept, particularly southern Europe, alive in the years just before the war, when there was tremendous crop failure and drought in what's now Italy and southern France. And all that changes when Howe is in Philadelphia. There's no access to those markets. There's also severe drought at periods of time. Without drought, you can grind no grain because it's water mills. And all the armies want that flour. If you are suddenly seeing a commissary of purchases, which is what they called it in the Continental Army, showing up at your door with a piece of paper saying that you're entitled to be paid in Continental currency at some later date for what you've just got on your farm, that's not going to be terribly attractive, and you might understandably hold something back. Or maybe if you live closer to New York, be tempted to sell it there in what in New Jersey they call the London trade, which is boats going to Staten Island from New Jersey to sell things to New York. But you run the risk of reprisals and punishment from patriot governments and militias, which in Pennsylvania included dead bodies by the roadside and confiscated goods dumped on top of them to prevent them from taking British gold. This was a mean war. This was not in any way genteel 18th century honorable exchanges of blows. This was a civil war and very violent. And people had to navigate it and make choices on how to survive it. So our Quaker friends here are in a pickle because their religion is completely opposed to war. And some of their business, the farms and the mills and the stores that they have, are not viable anymore, and they're viewed as being disloyal, so they're losing their stuff. You're either keeping your head down and hoping that your neighbors don't burn you down someday, or you're actively trying to leave the area, or a limited number are still loyal to the crown. Very difficult place. If you're an Anglican, you have the same problem. The king's the head of your church. If the king's the head of your church, you might very well have been willing to fight in 1775 in an agrarian revolt for your rights, right? But not in the summer of 1776 when it's about complete separation from the other countries. So you've got all that going on, and then you've got the problem of how do you feed and move. So Connecticut was called the provision state, and its provisions were on the hoof. So it's not producing a lot of wheat. It is producing flax, although that's even more further up the Connecticut River in Massachusetts. Very important for anything that has to do with linen. But beef, lots of it, and some pork. And on occasion, and this happens in a couple of times during the Continental Army's life, when the shad come up the river, there's a contract to get a lot of fish and then salt them. I'm old enough to remember when herring was used for lobster bait. My grandparents lived near Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, and that's what the herring run was for. And now the herring are so depleted, you go there in the spring to watch the spring migration, not to bait your lobster traps. The lobsters are all out in deep water now because of climate change. So to feed these guys involves contracts with farmers and commissaries, and another whole not particularly well-oiled machine of moving supplies and provisions to care for the Army and its dependents, and now these guys. If they're getting it, they're getting Indian meal and flour, and they're cooking it in the ways that were described, but not as hardtack. They're getting salt beef, they're getting salt pork, and occasionally they're getting fresh, which is really no different from what the Army's living on. Unless you're an officer and you're being put up in somebody's house, and then you might be eating a little better. And you're certainly drinking. Other questions, sir?
What about Fishkill Plains and Fishkill for growing wheat? I thought that was done.
So yes, not large enough to be. Yes, the question was, what about the wheat growing area in Fishkill Plains and Fishkill itself? And there are other areas to those I described. The ones I described were considered central. But it's true, Fishkill had some wheat, there are some other places that did, and the mid-Atlantic states are growing more wheat than New England is. So that is a true thing. But it's also near the limit of Continental Army and Patriot control. If you go much further south from that, you're in the neutral ground where there's lots of contested land, and it's not so easy, if you're a farmer, to grow that stuff because you don't know who's going to take it. Sir?
Yes, I guess two-part question. One, in your research, when you were trying to trace the route, would they camp, was there any rhyme or reason to the camping? Like, say, a captain of a militia happened to live in this area, would they want to maybe camp near his house, you know, or there's something like that. And then also, have you ever done from Millbrook, have you researched from Millbrook to maybe Fishkill, the route through here even further?
Only just begun that. So I can't tell you precisely what route. I'm very curious about what was meant by went from Mabbitts to Shays. Where is that? I don't know. Want to find out, right? But truly, in reviewing what I had done for my research in Connecticut for this is where I revisited that document and said, follow up on that. Your earlier question, Washington had very clear ideas about the route he wanted them to take. And he sent 2 letters at different times to Theodoric Bland saying, I want you to go from here to here to here to here. In some cases, he was too little too late. They had already moved where they were going to move. But he was trying to do it in a way where they were, again, taking the interior lines, and where he thought there was some reasonable opportunity to sustain them on roads that went the right direction. I can speak at much more length about Connecticut, so I will say there, it's about how far can men march, and are there places to shelter them at all? So in Barkhamsted, it's 8 barns and about 8 houses, and that's all the place is, and they're all jammed in there. In Sharon, there's a place called the Hessian Field. And the Hessian Field is viewable on 343 if you're going from Sharon Playhouse back to Amenia, and you look on the south side of the road, that hill. That's it. That hill and around the back. Imagine that with 4,000 men on it before they could move them again. The way the militia in Connecticut worked, they called out drafts from the 2 regiments that covered that route to escort the men. Where I live was the 14th Militia. Its colonel was Colonel Charles Burrell from Canaan. We have documents of ammunition being issued to the militia for this purpose and then turned in afterwards. We know that 14 dragoons from the 2nd Troop of Light Horse had payment for 14 days service during that period of time, and probably those guys are carrying messages between everything else and they're riding back and forth. And we know that there were commissaries trying to find enough wagons to move them and trying to find places to house them. But sometimes the best they can do is, where's the open field I can stick these men? And what houses are in the vicinity where I can stick the officers? So there are places where I know that a captain hosted a ball, but more often they're talking about what's the central community space in that area. They go to Mabbitts not because he's friendly, because it's known, and it's a gathering place, and it's a store, and it's a point you can point toward. And if you're Bland, you're from Virginia, you have to ask for the place people know. So that's what that is. Yes?
Wouldn't it be logical to basically say that these troops would follow the road where flour mills are, where the food production actually is?
If something that was thrown together in multiple states and with both local and Continental and Congress control can be logical, then yes, but it wasn't that. It was, first and foremost, find a route and find supplies along the way that avoids New York. And everything else they had to sort out themselves. So some of their choices, were as good as any other. But in the end, I think they had hungry days, I think they had wet days, I think they had wasted days. When you study this period, you will find that Congress often declares something. The uniform of this regiment shall be this. And then somebody issues something and it doesn't look like that. And then you see a runaway advertisement for a deserter and he's wearing something else. So absolutes and logic only take you so far when you're trying to piece together this stuff. It's contingency every single time. It's how do you adapt and accomplish a task which is unprecedented with the things you have at hand, which might be local militia, which might be a state commissary, which might be a detachment of Pennsylvania troops, dealing with a multicultural men, women, and children enemy force. I mean, it's remarkable they only lost 10%. It's remarkable they accomplished it in 3 months. Yes, and then yes.
They're on the move all the time.
Yeah.
And as you just mentioned, what did they do with the wounded? Because they're just on the go.
So they have had a year since their surrender. They left some of the sick men behind. Some men took sick and died. There are wagons being pressed, which means commandeered and maybe paid for with slips of paper from the inhabitants to support this. And if you lose your shoes and you are lamed, maybe you're riding with the baggage that day. It's a punishing pace to march in leather shoes that don't have a left or a right, which have probably also you've worn through the soles by this point and not seen new ones. That distance in the fall. It's very hard. I'm not suggesting that these people suffered differently than the actual armies, because they did not. They were actually treated as well as could be provided, which is not true for all prisoners. It's not true for all prisoners on each side. There's a whole other conversation we could have about the suffering of imprisoned people earlier in the war, when you got thousands of captives to house and no idea how to treat them, particularly if they happen to be rebels. So there's a lot of deaths that happen among the American forces in prison early in the war, which isn't just sadism and anger, it's lots of other things that led to that. For these people, they still have their surgeons with them, and there is this sense that it's your job to move as many of them as possible in a form that is as expeditious but also humane as possible. But, disease is killing more people at this time than battle wounds. And that's not something that they can do much about. Certainly on the march, it's hard to stay healthy. You had a question?
The women and children,
Yes.
are they mainly from the British, or were there the Russian women and were there
Both.
both?
Both.
And how did they ever keep up?
Oh my heavens. So 18th century armies have a community of civilians associated with them. Not every soldier's wife is there. Often it's a sergeant's wife, or often it's a restricted number of women who are allowed to go with the regiment, with the expectation that they will provide the services that were described, that they will launder and mend and tend the ill. And they have children and they bear children. There's roughly a comparable amount of German-speaking families and women as there are British in the Convention Army. I think the number surrendered is like 182 to total,
So-
or maybe it's another 100, maybe it's 282. It's a fairly large number. And some of those are officers' wives, there are a few of them, but most of them are women who are marching right there along with everyone else. And while they're necessary, they're not always valued or cared for the same. In the American Army, they're getting 1/3 the ration that's given to the men and women. What is it in the British Army?
Depending on the skill in the trade.
Okay.
But what's also interesting as far as from the British perspective, if your husband, if you were married to a soldier and he was killed, most regiments had a certain period of time in which you would be actually kicked out of the regiment if you did not marry another soldier to kind of regain your worth, if you will. They weren't going to feed and waste resources, especially cut off from main supply, on someone that wasn't contributing to the good of the regiment. I have yet to come across a story of anyone actually being removed from a camp, so those marriages just kind of kept on going.
They're also subject to Army discipline. So if you steal or if you break Army rules, you're subject to corporal punishment the same as the men, and there are episodes of that to our eyes are pretty horrific. And children are a fact of life, and imagining young children as part of this is a complicated thing to wrap your head around. Childbirth during, baby on your back, and it's worth thinking that there are communities around the Army who are just as affected as the fighters, and they're the most prime example of it. Other questions? Sir?
Well, if the woman was willing to stay on even after her husband was killed, and she was willing to stay on and provide the services that you all described,
Yep.
why would they kick her out?
So, and this, I don't say this in means of making it sound like women were considered property, because it was not that kind of situation. It was just, I suppose, a societal convention of like, this is the expectation. You know, you're here. A lot of the women also that were running sutleries or gaming, everything had to be permitted by the colonel. Like, there was this whole kind of very much still that social hierarchy of a wedded woman, not an unwed woman, who could, of course, engage in harlotry or any of these things that could erode the morale of the regiment.
Which, yes, her status would be in question and her virtue would be in question. And there are other people who are not listed on the rolls of the Army strength who are accompanying the Army, some of whom are prostitutes, some of whom are selling liquor they're not supposed to. You see that in every war.
But there were sisters too.
Yes. Which ones are you thinking?
I mean, I have, one of my ancestors was the sister of two soldiers.
And did she accompany the Army?
She accompanied the Army.
Fantastic. How do you have that documentation?
It's well written though.
That's wonderful. I think I'm going to make that our last question. We're, absolutely thrilled by your interest. There's so much more to dig into about this period. The 250th is not just the Declaration. We got 6 more years to go, and we had a decade before leading up to it. Lots of things to explore and to think about how the community where you live experienced it those many years ago. Thanks.
So I'll just say one thing really quick. Sorry, cutting off your
Yeah,
applause. Just a plug for our March program, which is the most appropriate possible talk in this space, which is a history of the Millbrook Library that Sam Falk, who's the president of the Friends of the Library, is doing, and she's been doing a lot of intrepid research into the history of the library. And let me just say, I can't imagine knowing as much about anything as Tim and Joe know about this topic. So let's give them a nice round of applause. And there there are cookies back here. I tried to make like red, white, and blue cookies for the top, but the colors didn't work out perfectly, and they kind of melted together. So you might need some like arm strength to really pry them apart. But they're back there if you